Professor Noam Chomsky, in your, if I'm not mistaken, first TV media appearance for Serbian media. Thank you very much for being with us. Last month marked the 7th anniversary of the beginning of the bombing of Yugoslavia. Why did NATO wage that war? Or I should say, why did the United States wage that war?
Well, actually, we have, for the first time, a very authoritative comment on that from the highest level of the Clinton administration. Mm-hmm. Which is something that one could have surmised before, but now it is asserted. This is from Stroop Talbot, who was in charge of the, he ran the Pentagon State Department Intelligence Joint Committee on the diplomacy during the whole affair, including the bombing. So that's very top of the Clinton administration. Mm-hmm. He just wrote the foreword to a book by his director of communications, John Norris. And in the foreword he says, if you really want to understand what the thinking was in the top of the Clinton administration, this is the book you should read. And you'll take a look at John Norris's book, and what he says is the real purpose of the war had nothing to do with concern for Kosovar Albanians. It was because Serbia was not carrying out the required social and economic reforms, meaning it was the last corner of Europe which had not subordinated itself to the U.S.-run neoliberal programs, so therefore had to be eliminated. That's from the highest level. Again, you could have guessed it, but I've never seen it said before. I mean, that it wasn't because of the Kosovar Albanians, that we know. There is just, I mean, this is a point of religious fanaticism in the West. Can't talk about it for interesting reasons having to do with Western culture. But there is just overwhelming documentation of impeccable documentation, two big compilations of the State Department trying to justify the war, the OSCE records, NATO records, the KVM Monitor records, long British parliamentary inquiry which went into it. They all show the same thing. I mean, sort of what we knew. I mean, it was an ugly place. There were atrocities.
But given this clear documentary record, I want to ask you about the elite intellectual opinion, what you call, in the United States.
And the West.
Because it was, and in the West in general, because
that's for a different
reviewing it, you would get the impression, you would be forgiven for imagining that every critic of the NATO intervention was one of two things, either a Milosevic sympathizer or someone who doesn't care about genocide. What does this mean?
Well, first of all, that's a common feature of intellectual culture. One good U.S. critic, Harold Rosenberg, once described intellectuals as the herd of independent minds. They think they're very independent, but they're stampede in a herd, which is true. When there's a party line, you have to adhere to it. And the party line is systematic. The party line is subordination to state power and to state violence. Now, you're allowed to criticize it, but on very narrow grounds. You can criticize it because it's not working, or it's a mistake, or benign intentions that went astray, or something. In fact, you see it right now in the Iraq War. There's a ton of debate about the Iraq War, but take a look at it. It's very similar to the debate in Pravda during the invasion of Afghanistan. Actually, I brought this up to a Polish reporter recently and asked him if he'd been reading Pravda. He just laughed. He said, yeah, it's the same. Now, you read Pravda in the 1980s, it's you know, the travail of the Russian soldiers, too many are getting killed, these terrorists who prevent us from bringing justice and peace to the Afghans. We of course didn't invade, we intervened in order to try to help them at the request of the legitimate government, and the terrorists are preventing us from doing all the things we want to do. You know, yeah. I've read Japanese counterinsurgency documents from the Second World War, from the 1930s. Same, you know, we're trying to bring them an earthly paradise, but the Chinese